When Michael was little, real little, about 2 or 3, there were a couple times when, he would throw fits, a little temper tantrum. And, for Michael, a discipline that really worked well was sending him to his room. Make him go sit in his room, because Michael hated to be away from everyone. He always wanted to be out with everyone else, and he wanted to be in the center of attention, or the center of the action. He always wanted to be there. And so this one worked really well for him. Now, a couple of times we tried something else that didn't work very well. We took him and, like, when he would throw a temper tantrum or a fit, or he was crying and upset, we would say, okay, you got to go to your room. And a couple times I said, and you need to settle down, and as soon as you stop crying, you can come out. That never happened. Because he was so upset that he was put away in his room that he might miss something. He would just cry and cry and cry. I got permission to tell you this story. So he would just cry and cry and cry. And there was nothing I could do to calm him down. In fact, I would go into his room and I'd sit next to him and I'd say, Michael, if you just settle down, you can come out. If you could just stop crying, you can come out. Trying to teach him a little self-control, but if you could just, it would never work. And I would end up having to take him and settle and calm him down myself and bring him out. Well, you see, my purpose in all of that was to have him out with us. But along the way, to teach him a little self-control. I think about that story because I'm thinking about what God has gone through with the Israelites. And I think there's some similarities there going on here with Israel and with God. God's purpose in all of that he's been doing with Israel is to bless them, to give them this land as an inheritance. And in the process, to teach them faith, to teach them how to live by faith. And we saw here as we've gone through the book of Numbers that the first generation, they failed. God said, okay, here we are at the land. We counted you, go in and take the land. And they came back and said, we can't. There's no way. And they failed to believe God. They failed to trust God. And so they failed to enter the land and receive the promises, receive the blessings. They failed. However, God's purpose did not change. And now as we come to the later parts of the book of Numbers, we see that the younger generation is now ready to go into the land. Now it's their opportunity to enter the land if they will go in faith, if they will live by faith. So the passage that we're coming to today in chapter 26 and following, it's basically, there's a couple things that we're going to see. We're going to see a census report where he tells the people he tells Moses to count the people, and we're going to read the report of that. And then they're going to talk about an inheritance issue. But even in these two seeming mundane things, there are some important truths that we can draw out of it, and some important principles that we can pull out of it for life. And so we begin in chapter 26, verse 1 and 2. It says, after the plague, the Lord said to Moses and to Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel, from 20 years old and upward, by their fathers' houses, all in Israel who are able to go to war. He begins by saying, after the plague. And the plague being referred to is the one we saw in the previous chapter, chapter 25, that had come, that was brought on by their immorality and idolatry. But now it's as if the cleansing has been done, and now it's time for the people to get ready to go into the land. So after the plague, he tells them, you need to take a census of the people. And this census that we see marks the transition from the time of the first generation, the older generation, and the story of that older generation, to the time and the story of the new generation, the younger generation that will enter the land. And so this is the second census that is being taken. And if you remember, almost 40 years ago, they took a census earlier. And that first 40 years ago was preparing them to enter into the land. God told them to number off right before they were to go into the land. But now it's time for the new generation to enter the land, and so they're preparing to go in. And the first step in preparation is to count the men of fighting age, and basically to muster the army. This is actually the reason for the census, to count the men who are of age to fight in the army and to muster that army together. So Moses, along with Joshua and Caleb, are the only 3 people left from that older generation. And Moses and Aaron took the first census, but now Moses and Aaron's son Eleazar are taking the second census. And I imagine as you read through this that this is a bittersweet time for the people of Israel and for Moses. First of all, for the people, because they're excited because now they get to go in the land. But they should have been and could have been living in the land for the last almost 40 years. These people could have grown up in the land, in the promised land. But they weren't, because the first generation had failed to follow God in faith. They'd failed to trust Him. They'd failed to believe God. And I think it's bittersweet for Moses, because here is Moses. He's led the people of Israel to the land. This people that he loves and that he has worked with and cared for and prayed for are about to go into the land. And he is still leading these people, but he himself does not get to go. And so in Israel, I assume at this time there is a mixture of both regret over past sins and feelings of hopeful expectation and joy about the future. And I think about that, life can be like that for all of us, not just for the Israelites, but for all of us. A mixture of regret over past sins and hopeful expectation of the future. But I think the key for us here is that we need to know that we can't let past sins paralyze us. We can't let things in the past that we look back and regret stop us from moving forward to what God would have us do now. It's kind of like Paul says in Philippians 3. He says, I forget what lies in the past and I press on to what lies ahead. So we don't let the past paralyze us or stop us, but we keep moving forward and following God in faith. So the people of Israel now here take this census. And the rest of this chapter 26, records the results of that census. But that's not all it says. There's also several additional points that are made. And the very first of those additional points is given to us in the report about the tribe of Reuben, the descendants of Reuben. Look at verse 9. He says, the sons of Eliab, Nemuel, Dathan, and Abiram, these are Dathan and Abiram, chosen from the congregation, who contended against Moses and Aaron in the company of Korah when they contended against the Lord. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up together with Korah when that company died, when the fire devoured 250 men, and they became a warning. But the sons of Korah did not die. You remember that rebellion? When Korah and these two men, these two descendants of Reuben, got together, and they got 250 men together, and they said, we should be priests. Not just the people God chose, but we want to be priests. Why shouldn't we be priests? We're special too. And they all got up there and took their censers and stood before God, and the fire came out from the tabernacle and consumed them. And then there were these two men, the two who are mentioned here, Dathan and Abiram, who refused to even come up to see Moses. They refused to acknowledge the leadership or the authority of Moses and Aaron. And they stayed in their tents, and God sent Moses to them, and he went there. He said, everyone get away from their tents. And then the ground opened up, and their tents and everything they had fell in and swallowed them up. Well, that's the story that's being talked about here. And these men that did this great evil are being commemorated here. not in a good sense, but in a bad sense. You see, this is a reminder to God's people not to be like them. This is a reminder to God's people that you don't follow in their ways. It's a reminder, do not rebel against God like they did. But what I find interesting is that at the very same time, the very last thing we're told is, but Korah's sons didn't die. You see, which lets us know that they were not part of the rebellion of their father. And God honors them here by mentioning that they continued to live. You see, they could have been put to death with their father just because of their association with their father. But God spared the innocent. So even with the negative things that are being reported here about the tribe of Reuben, the report on Reuben ends on a high note, and it highlights God's grace and God's justice. Because that's who God is. He is a God of grace and a God of justice. Well, as we continue reading, there's an interesting note that talks about the population of Simeon. The population of Simeon dropped drastically. Look at verse 14. It says, these are the clans of the Simeonites, 22,200. Now, you probably don't remember the number from before, but let me tell you, this number, their population, is 62.5% smaller. 62.5% smaller. Now, let me give what I think is the explanation of it. Possible explanation, probable explanation. I think it's the plague that just happened. You remember Zimri? He was the guy who came into the camp, who brought the Midianite woman with him, and walked right past the tabernacle, right past Moses, right past the people, and took them, it says, to his brothers, or to his family, or took the girl to his brothers, to his families. Zimri was the son from an important family within the tribe of Simeon. He was a leader amongst the Simeonite tribe. And coming back to his brothers may have a specific reference to the tribe of Simeon. But it seems that there was probably a large number of people from the tribe of Simeon who were involved in that sin, in that immorality, in that idolatry. And so they suffered a great loss in that plague. But their numbers dropped drastically. Well, as you continue reading through the book, or through the chapter, we're told the numbers from the tribe of Gad, from the tribe of Judah, from Issachar, from Zebulun, and then we come to Joseph, the tribe of Joseph, which is actually the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. Because Manasseh and Ephraim are the sons of Joseph, and remember, Joseph was given the double honor, the double inheritance. And so his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, were actually, it was almost like they were adopted by Jacob. And they were both given an equal share of the inheritance with the other brothers. And so here we have the tribes of Joseph, or Manasseh and Ephraim. And when we talk about Manasseh, there's this special note given in verse 33. And it says, in verse 33, it says, now Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, had no sons, but daughters. And the names of the daughters of Zelophehad were Mahlah, Noah, Haglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Some great names, right? So here we're mentioned, these five ladies are mentioned here. It's interesting to note, though, here, because there's no explanation for it. But they still stand out. And they are significant. But we notice this, they stand out because everyone else mentioned, almost everyone else mentioned in this list, are men. There's these five ladies, and there's going to be two other women who are mentioned in this list. But they stand out because they're almost all men. Well, the reason for this is not just because it's a patriarchal society, but because this list, is counting the army, the men of fighting age, the men who are going to go and fight. But here we have these five ladies who are listed also. And it doesn't tell us why, but we'll find out later. We'll come back to it. So then you continue on and give us the numbers from Benjamin, the numbers from Dan, and the tribe of Asher. And then we come in verse 46. And verse 46, it says, the name of the daughter of Asher was Sarah. So here's the other woman who is mentioned. And again, we're not given any explanation why she's mentioned. It's possible that she was the only daughter of Asher, and therefore she's listed here. But it's interesting that she still stands here in this list of men that she is named off specifically. And the only significance that I can draw from this is that even in this patriarchal culture, women are still important to God and to God's people. God puts high value on women. The thing is this is so true. And some people have tried to argue against it. Some people have said, look at the Bible. Look how it treats women. They aren't, women are second-class citizens. And I would argue that point, against that point. Because no matter what culture is being written to or described at different places in the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, God always places high value on women. Women are always spoken well of. No matter what roles are happening in that culture or in the Bible, women are elevated. The status of women are elevated in the Bible. And God values women. Well, you continue reading through chapter 26 and you're told the numbers from Naphtali, and then we're told the total in verse 51. It says, this was the list of the people of Israel, 601,730. Now, I made this point earlier when we talked about the first census, but I'm going to make it again. God preserved his people. In fact, God caused his people to flourish. You see, their population now, is only 0.3% smaller than it was almost 40 years ago when they came out of Egypt. That means after 40 years in the harsh wilderness, after everyone, and think about this, everyone who was older than 19 had died, their population is still just about the same, basically the same. So if you think about that, everyone who was 20 years old and older, except for Joshua and Caleb, have died. That means the only people who are alive in Israel are people who were 19 and younger or had been born since then. And their population has stayed steady. God has caused his people to flourish, even under the harshest of conditions. God is faithful to his people and his promises. Let's read in verse 52 through 56. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, among these the land shall be divided for inheritance, according to the number of names. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Every tribe shall be given its inheritance in proportion to its list. But the land shall be divided by lot. According to the names of the tribes of their father, they shall inherit. Their inheritance shall be divided according to lot between the larger and the smaller. This was the list of the... let me stop there. At this point, the census has been interrupted. You may not have noticed yet, but the Levites haven't been talked about yet. But it's interrupted here because now we're talking about inheritance. And if you remember, here he's talking about inheritance and how the land is going to be divided. If you remember, the Levites, they don't get the same inheritance as the rest of Israel. They have a different inheritance. In fact, God told them that he was their inheritance, that he would be their portion. Because remember, they have the privilege of having this unique relationship with God and leading people into the tabernacle before the presence of God, helping people with their sacrifices and becoming right before God and having fellowship with God. That is their inheritance. This huge privilege that they have as serving as priests and in and around the tabernacle. That is their inheritance. But here in these verses 52 to 56, it tells us how that they are to divide the land amongst all the people, all the other people, the other tribes other than Levi. And he says they're to be divided fairly by the size of the different tribes. So a big tribe gets a big section of land. A small tribe gets a smaller section of land. He says it's going to be divided fairly. But the interesting thing is that it tells us that it will be assigned by lot. In other words, what we might call drawing straws. Who gets the short straw? Who gets the long straw? In other words, they would do it by lot. But the point of this is that God would guide them in choosing the who gets what land. In other words, God was showing them who should get what. Because when they divided by lot or did things by lot, they would pray and they were seeking God's guidance and they were asking Him to show them the answer. And so when they did this, God was basically guiding or controlling the situation to show them who should have which land. Now the interesting thing or the cool thing about this is that this means that this division of land was not done by man, but by God. So it couldn't be disputed. They couldn't fight over the land and say, wait a minute, I want that land. Wait a minute, you gave yourself the good land. And like kids do, siblings do. He said, you can't have that argument because God is guiding this process. And it's divided by lot. Through the guidance of God. It was given directly from God. It was an inheritance from God. Well, then the following verses talk about the count of the Levites. What's interesting, though, that they don't count the Levites every male who's 20 and over. But they count every male who is 1 month old and over. And the thing is this is a different count. They're not being counted for battle or to be a part of the army. They've been set aside to serve or set apart to serve God. They're being counted to serve God in the tabernacle and around the tabernacle. And as we're talking about the Levites, Aaron, Moses, and Miriam, that's the third woman, or the other woman who was mentioned. Aaron, Moses, and Miriam are singled out because of their unique leadership role in Israel. And then from there, they continue talking about the line of Aaron and his sons because they are the priests. And it makes clear that Aaron and his sons are to be the priests. They are God's choice for the priests. But then notice what it says in verse 61. It says, but Nadab and Abihu, these are two of Aaron's sons, two of the priests, but Nadab and Abihu died when they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. Now, we didn't see that story in the book of Numbers. We didn't come across it. But if you turn back to Leviticus chapter 10, you'll find out what happened. Leviticus chapter 10, we have the story of these two sons of Aaron. Chapter 10, beginning in verse 1, it says, now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire, so what's going on here is they took their censers, the little dish that held the incense, and they lit it up and they burned it. They started burning this incense. But if you remember when we went through this earlier and talked about the tabernacle, they were told specifically what incense to burn before God. And they were told, do not burn any other incense. This is the only authorized incense that you were to burn to God. But they took something else, a different incense, and they burned it. And verse 2 says, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. And you might think, man, that seems a little harsh, but keep reading. Verse 3 says, then Moses said to Aaron, because I think Aaron may have been thinking that. Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified. And before all the people, I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. You see, what Moses is saying is, God is saying, if you are to come near me, the priests, those who are serving me, those who are representing me before the people and representing the people to me, he said, they will treat me as holy. You know why? Because God is holy. God is not making some unreasonable demand here. God is holy, and those who are to draw near to him as priests were to treat him as holy, because that's who he is. And Aaron, we're told, held his peace. In other words, when he heard the explanation, he said, okay, it's right. See, I imagine Aaron was upset. His two sons were just put to death. He's like, well, but here's the explanation. He says, it's right. But we're told about this in Numbers, reminded that these two sons had died. As a reminder again, that those who are serving God and those who come near Him are to treat Him as holy because He is holy. Well, our census report in chapter 26 is wrapped up in verses 63 to 65. It says, these were those listed by Moses and Eleazar the priest, who listed the people of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. But among these, there was not one of those listed by Moses and Aaron the priest, who had listed the people of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said to them, they shall die in the wilderness. Not one of them was left, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. So the older generation has all died off. None of them will enter into the land except for these two men. They have died off and not been allowed to enter land because of their faithless rebellion against God. Only Joshua and Caleb are allowed to come in. Why? Because they were men of faith. When all the others went and said, we can't do it. They're giants. They're huge. They'll kill us all. They'll wipe us out. Joshua and Caleb stood up and said, let's go. God said He's giving us the land. Let's go. Why would we doubt that? Is there any reason for us not to go? No. They believed God. They were men of faith. And so they were allowed to receive the blessing. They were given this inheritance. Because it's only by faith that we receive the blessings of God. Whether you're talking about back in Israel's time or today, it is only by faith that we receive the blessings of God. Now remember those ladies we were talking about? Those 5 daughters? We're going to come back to them now, and we see that not only are there men of faith, but there are also women of faith as well. Chapter 27, beginning in verse 1, he says, then drew near the daughters of Zelophehad, the sons of Hepher, the son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, from the clans of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Maachah, Noah, Haglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the chiefs of all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah. But he died for his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. Now we know why these women were mentioned. Now we know why the ladies we were introduced to the ladies earlier. They've got a situation that needs to be handled. And at the heart of this issue, this heart of their situation, is inheritance. The inheritance given to the people of God as a blessing from God. But see, there's a problem. In that day, in that culture, the inheritance was passed down through the men, through the sons. But this man, Jephunneh, had no sons. He only had daughters. So that means his daughters would get no part of the land for an inheritance. And, this is the big one, I think, for them, their father's name would be forgotten. You see, his line, his inheritance, his heritage would be gone, would be forgotten. And I think that's their key concern. But we see that they and their father, though they are part of the covenant community, would not have a share in God's inheritance. And so the 5 sisters, they come and they approach the leadership of Israel and they state their case before them. And they say, our dad was not part of the rebellion. He didn't join with Korah. He didn't do those rebellious things that the others did. But they say he died of natural causes. In other words, the same common fate of the older generation that has just died off. And so they say he shouldn't be dishonored by not receiving part of the inheritance and forgotten just because he had no son. And the ladies are asking that they be given their father's inheritance, the father's portion of the land that belonged to that tribe, their tribe, the tribe of Manasseh. But there's three things that are striking about these ladies. The first is they came humbly. I don't see any arrogance. I don't see any demands. They come and ask. But the other thing is they don't suggest, our father never did anything wrong. But did you notice how they said he died? He died in his own sins, or for his own sins. See, they recognize that their father was a sinner, just like everyone else. But they say he wasn't one of those rebellious. He wasn't part of that rebellion, but he was a sinner. But they come humbly. The second thing is that they come courageously. We're told that they come and they approached the tabernacle, the front of the tent of meeting. They approached the tabernacle, which represented the presence of God. So they came and they approached God. They approached Moses. They approached Eleazar, the priest. And they approached the entire male leadership of Israel. And anybody in Israel who would have seen these 5 ladies just walking up to the front of the tabernacle and all the leadership there would have said, what are they doing? But they came courageously. And the third thing is they came in faith. Because if you notice what they said, they believe that God will give Israel this land. They expect that this land is going to be divided amongst the people. Just as God said it would. Just as God had promised. There's no ifs here. They don't come and say, well, if we happen to get the land. They just basically come and say, hey, why should we be left out? Can we have a part of it? It's not a question of if, it's a when. So just like Joshua and Caleb, who had faith, and that God will do what he says he'll do, these ladies come believing that God will do what he said he'll do. They're women of faith. Let's keep reading in verse 5. It says, Moses brought their case before the Lord. So Moses said, hey, that's interesting. He goes to God and asks him about it. And the Lord said to Moses, verse 7, the daughters of Zelophehad are right. So God says, hey, their concern is a good concern. They are correct in asking this and making this point. He says, they are right. You shall give them possession of an inheritance among their father's brothers and transfer the inheritance of their father to them. And then you shall speak to the people of Israel. So see, God has said, this is what you're going to do for them. And he says, and I'm making a general rule for all of Israel. He continues there in verse 8. He says, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. And it shall be for the people of Israel a statute and rule as the Lord commanded Moses. So he says, you give it, if a man dies and he has no sons, you give it to his daughters. If he doesn't have daughters, then he gives brothers. And he goes on and he steps further and further away. But basically the point is, you give it to his nearest relatives. That is that man's inheritance, and it is to stay in the family. And so you would pass it on to the nearest relatives. And so he makes this point, but then God makes this rule, but it raises another issue. Turn to the very end of the book of Numbers, chapter 36. And some men from this tribe of Manasseh come to Moses. Look what they say. Verse 1 says, the heads of the fathers' houses of the clan of the people of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, from the clans of the people of Joseph, came near and spoke before Moses and before the chiefs and the heads of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel. So they're making that same walk that the ladies did. And they come up and they speak to them, and they have an issue as well. They said, verse 2, they said, "The Lord commanded my Lord," speaking about Moses, commanded Moses, "to give the land for their inheritance by lot to the people of Israel. And my Lord was commanded by the Lord to give the inheritance of Zelophehad, our brother, to his daughters. But if they are married to any of the sons of the other tribes of the people of Israel, then their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of our fathers and added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. So it will be taken away from the lot of our inheritance. And when the Jubilee of the people of Israel comes, their inheritance will be added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. And their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of the tribe of our father." Let me explain what they're saying here. They're saying if these girls are given the inheritance of their father, they own land that is part of the land of Manasseh. And if now they go and they marry someone from a different tribe, say someone from Judah, their son would then inherit their land. So then someone from Judah would own land in Manasseh's territory. And they're saying our territory is going to be lost. But this territory, the territory of Manasseh, belongs to us because it is God's inheritance to us. And so they say, there's a problem here. And this is, what do we do? They're not complaining about God's rule. They're not coming and say, that was a bad rule you made up. They're just saying, how do we deal with this situation? We've got an issue. We've got a problem. How do we figure this out? So they come and they ask this question. And then keep reading in verse 5. "And Moses commanded the people of Israel according to the word of the Lord, saying, the tribe of the people of Joseph is right." So in other words, Moses went to God again, and God tells him, they're right. This is a legitimate concern. Here's how you take care of it. Verse 6 says, "This is what the Lord commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry who they think best. Only they shall marry within the clan of the tribe of their father. The inheritance of the people of Israel shall not be transferred from one tribe to another. For every one of the people of Israel shall hold on to the inheritance of the tribe of his father. And every daughter who possesses an inheritance in any tribe of the people of Israel shall be wife to one of the clan of the tribe of her father, so that every one of the people of Israel may possess the inheritance of their fathers. So no inheritance shall be transferred from one tribe to another, for each of the tribes of the people of Israel shall hold on to its own inheritance. The daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord commanded Moses. For Mahlah, Tirzah, Haglah, Milcah, and Noah, the daughters of Zelophehad, were married to sons of their father's brothers. In other words, men from their own tribe. They were, verse 12, they were married into the clan of the people of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in the tribe of their father's clan. These are the commandments and the rules that the Lord commanded through Moses to the people of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. And so God says their concern is right. And he goes on and explains, this is what you do. He says the ladies are free to marry whoever they choose, but within their own tribe. Now we hear that on one hand, we say, man, that sounds more like a restriction than anything else. And in one sense, it is a restriction, but it also gave them great freedom. Because remember, in this culture, in this time, who did the choosing of who you were going to marry? Either your parents or the husband. Marriages were often arranged, or the husband chose the wife and then went to the parents and said, hey, I want to marry your daughter. But here we're told that the ladies have the right to choose who they will marry. And they can marry whoever they want as long as it's someone within their clan. And this gave them the right to both marry whoever they wanted and to retain their inheritance from God. And so God gives them this rule to provide for them and to protect the inheritance of the people and protect the right of these ladies to marry. And in doing so, their father's name is not forgotten. Now I want you to notice one last thing here in the book of Numbers. Not that we're done with the book of Numbers, we'll be back, but we just finished reading the very last verses of the book of Numbers, and we see this, that it ends on a high note of obedience. Because these ladies, they did what God said. They heard it, they were good with it, and they obeyed God. And what's interesting is in these chapters that we've looked at today, within a book that mentions very few women, at least by name, these ladies have been mentioned 3 times. They were named off 3 times in the verses that we read this morning. They have been commemorated for their faith. They have been commemorated so that we will remember them. And these ladies are examples to all of God's people of faith. But in these verses that we've looked at today, there are 2 things that stand out: purpose and faith. God has a purpose, a plan, a promise to fulfill. And God's people must live by faith. And people of faith believe God and obey Him. You see, God has always had a purpose for His people. When we're talking about Israel, His purpose was to give them this land as an inheritance. And there are those who failed to receive the land because they didn't believe. They didn't have faith. And therefore they wandered in the wilderness until they died off. In fact, the entire first generation, except Joshua and Caleb, did not enter the land, did not receive that blessing from God. But that didn't change God's purpose. And those who came later who had faith, they did receive the inheritance. They did receive the blessing from God. Now the thing is, God still purposes to bless His people. And here by His people, what I mean is all those who come to Him by faith in Jesus Christ. His purpose is to bless His people. In fact, Galatians 3:26 says, "For in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith." You must come by faith, but you become a child of God when you believe in Jesus. Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." So it's by faith that we come to God. By faith in Jesus Christ, by believing in Jesus, believing in His death on the cross, believing that He is the Son of God who lived a sinless life and died on the cross in our place to take the punishment that we deserve. By faith in Jesus, we receive the blessings of God. And as God's children, we look forward to a great inheritance. Not just land on this earth, but a greater inheritance than that. We look forward to an eternal home. We look forward to our complete salvation, to living with God forever. But God's purpose for us is even more than just saving us from judgment. God's purpose for us is to make us holy, to make us like His Son, to make us like Jesus. I want you to turn to Romans 8. This is a verse that many people quote when you're going through hard times. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Romans 8:28 says this, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good." Now that's the part that people quote. They say, whatever you're going through, it's going to turn out for your good. But we need to keep reading. It says, "For those who are called according to His purpose." And then the next verse says, "For those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that we might be the firstborn among many brothers." And he goes on. But he says, "To those, everything works together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose." And what is His purpose? He foreknew you to predestine you to the image of His Son. To be conformed to the image of His Son. That is His purpose. His purpose is to make you righteous, to make you like Jesus, to save you from your sins so that you could become holy and become like Jesus. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, "For our sake he made him who knew no sin to be sin," talking about Jesus, "so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." You see, that's his purpose, is to make for himself a holy people, righteous people, to make us like Jesus. See, God has a purpose for your life, and it is a good purpose. But we must be people of faith. People of faith, first by believing in Jesus. I mean, that's the starting point. Becoming a child of God through faith in Jesus. But then we must continue to live by faith, to trust God, to obey God. And as we live by faith, we will become more like Jesus. And as we live by faith, we will understand what it means to have abundant life. We will understand the joy and the peace that only comes as a blessing from God. And as we live by faith, we will please God, who has given us all things. Live by faith.